Welcome to week 2 of The Forge, where we're gonna crack open a PC. What we're looking at this week are the insides of a typical desktop workstation. If you didn't already, PC stands for personal computer. So technically any cell phone computing device could be considered a personal computer. But in the IT world, it's pretty unanimously agreed upon that PC represents any computer running the Windows operating system. A Mac computer has all the same components that a PC does, they're just built and put together in a very proprietary way. They have their own models for motherboards and power supplies and all the other things we're going to talk about. But over here in PC world, there's some standards for manufacturing all these parts so that people can buy the parts individually and put them together themselves. There's some important terms to understand when talking about a computer. Usually when we say computer, we're referring to the whole thing, the mouse, the keyboard, the screen, and the big box. But there's actually some very specific categories that each of those things fall under. Anything that is not the box is called a peripheral. This includes the monitor, aka screen, the mouse, the keyboard, the speakers. All of these are peripheral or on the side of the main box, right? The term periphery means on the edges, right? Not the main thing. So peripherals don't really do much of the heavy lifting in terms of computing. They're just there to provide ways to interact with the box, which does all the computing. All right, now the technical term for that is not the box. We're going to go with CompTIA's standard definition for that and call it the system unit. Now we're going to crack open the system unit here in a minute, but before that, we want to take a look at the outside of it and see what we see. Now most computers you come across have something like this in the back. This is called the input-output area. This area determines what kind of connections can be made to that motherboard, which we'll talk about more here in just a minute. But it's really important to be familiar with all these connections, as they really determine what your system is capable of. Now the first one we're going to talk about is one you're probably pretty familiar with, and that's the HDMI connection. HDMI stands for High Definition Multimedia Interface. And the reason it's named such is that it actually transfers both audio and visual data, something that older connections could not do. Next up is another one everyone should be familiar with, USB, otherwise known as Universal Serial Bus. Older computers had a pretty intense array of different kinds of connections, all meant for different things. You had a specific connection for your printer, you had a specific connection for your video, you had one for any external storage drives that you might have attached to the computer, but they were all different connections. And that drove consumers crazy! Thankfully, someone came up with a universal interface for data transfer, which is what USB is. Let's talk about that middle word, serial. Now obviously it's spelled differently from the kind of cereal that you eat. A good way to think of serial is in series, or one after another in a straight line. This is how USB transfers information from one piece of hardware to another. Older technologies transfer data in parallel. Imagine a horse race where each horse starts at the gate and all the horses are let out at the same time. Now what's different about this horse race is that at the other end of that track, there's eventually going to be a single gate where each horse has to go through and figure out where it's going next. You can imagine there'd be something of a traffic jam as all the horses reach that gate at different times and try to figure out where it's going, and it slows that process down. This is essentially what's happening in parallel transfer, except as soon as one group of horses is let out, a split second later another whole group of horses is let out, and another, and another, and another, and another, and another. If those horses are representing pieces of data, you have tons of data that's getting traffic jammed. Now eventually every horse gets to where they're supposed to go, it just takes a while. Computer scientists figured out that it's actually faster and more efficient to transfer data serially, or in a single line, and one at a time. Now imagine a single horse leaving the gate and running at full speed all the way through the track and through that door at the other end. And immediately after that horse leaves, another horse is able to leave at full speed, and another, and another, and another. And that's serial data transfer. In any case, USB is awesome. It really improved the market for a lot of products because now everything had a single interface they had to worry about. They didn't have to worry if their product was compatible with this connection or that connection or that connection. It was all under one umbrella, USB. Now before we get carried away, it's important to note that there are different types of USB connections. Can you imagine having a big old USB Type A connection on your tiny smartphone? Yeah, no. Especially when mobile devices came on the market, it became necessary to make smaller and smaller versions of an interface. Now the way it transfers data is still the same. It's just that the connection type's a little different. There's USB Type A, which is what most people are familiar with. There's Type B, it's a little square one that you commonly see on printers. There's Type C, which is the most recent that you see on a lot of mobile devices. There's micro USB, mini USB, all manner of connections that could be tailored to whatever device it's on, but still all transfer data the same way. Now the version of USB has changed over the years to get faster and faster and faster at how it transfers data. A USB 2.0 we had a long time, and it could transfer data at 480 megabits per second. Then USB 3.0 came along and blew that out of the water at 4,800 megabits per second. That's 10 times as many horses through that track per second. But hold up, I'm not done. USB 3.1 came along and totally changed the game. Now we could transfer data up to 5 gigabits per second. Just for reference, 1 gigabit is 1,000 megabits. And if that wasn't enough, they doubled that and came out with 3.1 generation 2, which could transfer at 10 gigabits per second. Remember that thing I said about technology improving every week? But a way that you can tell the difference between USB generations, especially for the Type A connector, is by what color the plastic inside that connection is. Usually USB 2.0 will be just a solid black color. When 3.0 came along, you saw a blue color. That stayed with 3.1, kind of a royal blue. With 3.1 generation 2, you see kind of an aqua blue-green color. Again, those colors aren't super standardized, but generally speaking, you can make some kind of determination based on that. At any rate, USB is great. It solved a lot of product compatibility issues, and the technology continues to improve where we can transfer data faster and faster and faster. Now, somewhere we don't have as much of a universal solution is video connections. Now, even though HDMI is really popular and used everywhere, there's another one that's really common called DisplayPort. Now, DisplayPort essentially does exactly what HDMI does. It'll carry audio and video. However, DisplayPort has a little bit more bandwidth to play with and can push a little bit more data through. For all you gaming nerds out there, that means that refresh rate on your monitor is a little crisper. But for general use, you can consider it something exactly like HDMI. Next is another one you might be familiar with. It's the Ethernet port, technically called an RJ45 connector. This port is what allows your system to be connected to a network of other computers, including the internet. Next thing you might see are the different analog or digital audio options. And we can take a minute to talk here about the difference between analog and digital information. This applies to sound and video technology like we were talking about before. Let's use sound as an example. We're not going to go too deep into this, but I want you to understand. When we talk about analog sound, sound travels through the air in what are called sound waves. And depending on the frequency of those waves or how close those waves are together, that changes the sound. So a really high frequency sound has waves that are really close to each other. And a low frequency sound has big, long, rolling waves. And everything between those two is how you hear my voice. It's how you hear music. Now, when computers came along, we were able to represent things like sound digitally. When we say something is represented digitally, then we're talking about ones and zeros. Binary. And what's more, a computer doesn't really actually understand what a 1 or a 0 is, but it can understand electricity being on or off. If an electrical signal is carried through that's on, that's a 1. If a signal is off, that's a 0. This is the foundation of all programming and really all computation that a computer is capable of. All of the little color jacks in the back, those are analog audio jack. Now, the colors may vary sometimes, but generally the green is used for a front speaker out. In other words, the audio coming out of the computer to the speakers. The orange is used for a subwoofer out. You really want that bass to kick. And the black or sometimes gray one is used for rear speaker out. So you could have surround sound, front and rear speakers. The blue was a line audio in, so if you're taking audio from some source and putting it into the computer, that's where that happened. And similar to that, the red was used for a mic in, so if you had a microphone that you're going to talk to and sending that audio into the computer to do something with. Now, contrast to analog audio, there was the digital option. This looks like a little gray garage door. The name of this connection is an SPDIF out. SPDIF stands for Sony Philips Digital Interface. Sony and Philips, the two audio companies. On to the next one. Now we're going to talk about some older connection types that you don't see too often anymore, but you may still see, so it's good to know. Back before USB, we used to have separate connections for a mouse and a keyboard. Those were called PS2 connections. And no, that's not PlayStation 2, it stands for Personal System 2. On a lot of older computers, you will see these two separate connections. One was a green color, another one was kind of a purple color. The thing is, you actually still see that connection on a lot of modern gaming motherboards. Some really invested gamers figured out that the response time on a PS2 connection was actually faster than a USB connection. A lot of gamers like to see a PS2 connection on their computer so that they have that competitive edge. Last couple things we're going to talk about are some older video connections. Remember that talk we had about analog and digital? Analog video connection back in the day was what's called a VGA connection, or a video graphics array. This was able to transfer analog video signals from a system unit to a monitor. But analog video signals aren't quite as crisp and clear as digital ones. A little in-between step between VGA and HDMI was the DVI cable, or digital video interface. Now this looked a lot like a VGA cable, it was just a little wider and had more pins, but it was able to transfer video signal from a system unit to a monitor digitally. Or once again, all right, those are our input-output connections. Now let's talk about what's in the system unit itself. A lot of people say that when you pop open a computer and look inside, it looks like a little miniature city. And it's actually not a bad way to think about it. In this city are a bunch of blocks and buildings that all do very specific things and require specific amounts of power. So we'll start there. A power supply is the part that you plug into the wall in your home. Now what a power supply actually does, it takes AC power or alternating current power from an outlet and turns it into DC power, or direct current, which is what's required for all the individual components on the motherboard. We'll talk more in depth about that later, but that's the basics. Next is the motherboard. Now the motherboard is how all the different parts of your system work together. The features of any given motherboard are going to determine exactly what your computer is capable of. Like we said before, every motherboard has certain I/O connections. It has a certain amount of RAM it's able to accept. It has a specific slot for specific CPUs. It has an arrangement of expansion slots, a number of inputs for extra drives. If that all sounded too crazy, don't worry, we're going to talk all about that later. Everything about your computer's capabilities ultimately comes down to the motherboard. Let's say, for example, that you wanted to build a computer that was able to support 2 monitors. Well, to be able to do that, you need a motherboard that has 2 video connections on the I/O area, something like this. Here we can see we have an HDMI port and a display port, so you can plug 2 monitors into this motherboard and have all that extra screen space. Now next is arguably what could be called the brain of your computer. Now, even though the motherboard connects everything in the computer, it's the CPU, or the central processing unit, that handles the brunt of all that calculation. Now, because that CPU is doing so much calculation, it tends to run a little hot. So it's absolutely necessary that there be some way to cool that CPU down when it gets running too hot. Now, there's a lot of different ways to do this. Sometimes it's just a straight up fan. There's fancy liquid cooling systems. Next are the RAM slots, where the RAM sticks live. We'll go more into depth with RAM later, but for now you can just think of it as the short-term or working memory of the computer. In contrast to that would be the storage. This is where you see things like 500 gigabyte or terabyte or 2 terabyte hard drives. This is how you're able to store digital information. So we can think of storage as the long-term memory of a computer. Now, something very common in modern computers are a GPU, or a graphics processing unit. This is essentially like a little computer for your computer. Very essential to gamers. A GPU can boost your graphics processing power, which allows you to play crisper games at a higher frame rate. But it really is just like a helpmeet for the CPU. Instead of your CPU handling all that intense graphics, it offloads a lot of that work to the GPU. The last thing you'll often see on a computer case are expansion bays. This is where you can seat or add any expansions you might have for a system, like a disk drive or some kind of special audio interface. It's really just room to put some of the things that you might add to your computer at another time. Whew! I know that was a lot, but I'm confident you guys will be able to get these basics down before we do a deeper dive into each of these areas as the weeks go by. Thanks for joining me today, and we'll see you next week when we take a closer look at power supplies. See you in the forge.